The rain fell in a cold, persistent sheet over Blackwood Cemetery, a final gray curtain on the life of Grayson Davenport. Hundreds of black umbrellas huddled together like a mournful flock, shielding the city's elite from the heavens' uncaring tears. At the center of it all stood his wife, Karina, a statue of perfect, dignified grief in a Chanel black veil. Every eye was on her, the grieving widow of a titan. But then, through the gates, a figure appeared, a slash of brilliant, defiant white against the sea of black. A woman in a form-fitting white dress, no coat, no umbrella, letting the rain plaster her hair to her face. She walked not with shame, but with purpose, directly towards the casket. Whispers turned to gasps as the truth hit the crowd like a physical blow. This was Bianca Reed, the mistress, and she had come to claim her place. Karina Davenport felt the chill long before she saw her. It wasn't the October rain seeping into the marrow of her bones, but a different kind of cold, the icy premonition of a carefully constructed world about to shatter. For 25 years, she had been Mrs. Grayson Davenport. It was more than a title, it was a career. She had managed the homes, raised the children, hosted the fundraisers, and stood smiling by his side as he built an empire. She had been the perfect partner, the unshakable matriarch. Her grief, like her life, was impeccably managed, deep, genuine, but private. For the public, she wore the mask of stoic sorrow, her posture ramrod straight, her hand resting gently on the arm of their son Ethan. The funeral was a testament to their life together. The mayor was there, along with senators and rival CEOs who had flown in from 3 continents. It was a state funeral in all but name, a final display of the power and influence of the Davenport name. The eulogies were moving, painting Grayson as a visionary, a philanthropist, a family man. Karina listened, a single, perfectly timed tear tracing a path down her cheek. She knew the man they were describing, but she also knew the man who came home late, smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers, the man whose phone held secrets she chose not to unlock. She had made her peace with that man, chalking it up to the price of the life she lived, a life of comfort, of status, of unwavering security. Then the whispers started, a ripple of discord in the solemn symphony of mourning. Karina's eyes, trained to scan a room and assess any threat to her family's decorum, followed the gaze of the crowd, and she saw her, Bianca Reed. The name was a bitter taste in her mouth, a secret she had held like a shard of glass under her tongue for the last 3 years. She knew of her existence, of course. A discreet private investigator had provided a slim file. Bianca Reed, 28, an art gallery assistant. Young, beautiful, foolishly in love. Karina had seen the photos, the clandestine meetings in boutique hotels, the weekend trips disguised as business conferences. She had endured it, as she had endured the others before her, confident that Grayson would eventually tire of his latest infatuation and return, as he always did, to the solid foundation of their marriage. But this was different. This was not a private humiliation. This was a public declaration of war. Bianca's white dress was an obscenity in the monochrome landscape of grief. It clung to her slender frame, the rain making it almost translucent. It wasn't a dress of mourning, it was a wedding dress, a dress of celebration, of ownership. Her face, streaked with rain and mascara, was a mask of raw, unfiltered agony. This was not the contained sorrow of a widow. It was the wild, theatrical despair of a lover. She walked with a strange, hypnotic grace, her heels sinking slightly into the wet grass. The crowd parted for her, a silent, shocked wave. She didn't look at them. Her eyes were fixed on the polished mahogany casket resting on its bier, draped in a blanket of white roses. Karina's choice. Ethan, a younger, harder version of his father, stiffened beside Karina. "Mother!" he hissed, his voice low and furious. "What is she doing here? I'll have security remove her." "No," Karina said, her voice impossibly calm, though her gloved fingers dug into Ethan's arm. "We will not make a scene. We will ignore her. She is nothing." But Bianca would not be ignored. She reached the casket, her chest heaving with sobs. She ran a trembling hand over the smooth wood, her touch possessive, intimate. "Grayson," she cried out, her voice breaking, carrying across the hushed cemetery. "My love, they can't keep me from you. They can't." She turned then, her wild eyes locking onto Karina's. The polite fiction of the day was ripped away. There was no more pretense. There was only the wife, standing in her rightful place, and the mistress who had come to usurp it. "You," Bianca spat, pointing a shaking finger at Karina. "You have no idea how much he loved me. These last years, they were ours. This life you had with him was a lie. He was with me. He was mine." The crowd gasped. The press, held at a respectable distance, began to surge forward, their cameras flashing like lightning in the gray gloom. Karina felt a wave of nausea. All her years of careful planning, of maintaining the pristine facade of the Davenport family, were being incinerated by a hysterical girl in a wet white dress. Karina raised her chin, her voice cutting through the air, cold and sharp as ice. "You are mistaken," she said, each word a carefully polished stone. "You were a diversion, a fleeting mistake. I am his wife. This is my family's grief. Please have the decency to leave." Bianca let out a laugh that was half sob, half shriek. "Decency? You talk to me of decency? I was his life. He was going to leave you. He told me. He was going to divorce you and marry me. I was to be the next Mrs. Davenport." It was the ultimate insult, the one thing that could crack Karina's porcelain composure. The suggestion that she was replaceable, that her quarter-century of devotion could be erased by a tawdry affair. "You are delusional," Ethan snarled, stepping forward. "Get out of here before I have you thrown out." "No!" Bianca screamed, positioning herself between Ethan and the casket, a feral animal protecting her territory. "I have a right to be here. I'm the one he truly loved. I am his real wife in his heart, and that's more than she ever was." The scene was spiraling into a public relations nightmare, a ghoulish spectacle for the society pages. Karina felt a tremor of panic. She saw her life's work turning to ash. Just as the chaos reached its peak, a calm, authoritative voice sliced through the tension. "That is incorrect." All heads turned. Stepping out from behind the small group of family members was Desmond Crane, Grayson's longtime lawyer and executor of his estate. He was a tall, severe man in his late 60s, his face a roadmap of difficult negotiations and airtight contracts. He moved with an unnerving stillness, his gaze sweeping over Bianca, then Karina. He walked calmly to stand between the two women, a neutral arbiter in this war of hearts. He looked directly at Bianca, his expression unreadable, almost pitying. "Miss Reed," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You were many things to Grayson Davenport, but I can assure you, on the pain of disbarment and with full legal certainty." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy and suffocating in the rain-soaked air. He then turned his gaze slightly, a flicker of it landing on Karina, before returning to the distraught woman in white. "You're not the wife." The words hung in the air, stark and absolute. "You're not the wife." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain drumming on 100 umbrellas. Bianca Reed stared at Desmond Crane, her face a canvas of disbelief. The righteous fury that had propelled her through the cemetery gates seemed to drain away, replaced by a hollow confusion. What are you talking about?" she stammered. "Of course she is the wife. That's the whole point. He was going to leave her for me." She gestured wildly at Karina, as if she were an inanimate object, an obstacle that had now been legally dismissed. Desmond Crane's face remained impassive. "Security," he said, his voice never rising but cutting through the noise. Two large men in black suits, who had been hovering at the edge of the scene, moved forward with practiced efficiency. "Please escort Miss Reed to the chapel vestry. Mrs. Davenport, Ethan, Sophie, I ask that you join us as well, immediately." He gave no room for argument. The authority he wielded was not just that of a lawyer, but of a man who held all the secrets, the keeper of Grayson Davenport's final wishes. The security guards gently but firmly took Bianca by the arms. Her fight was gone. She allowed herself to be led away, her white dress now looking pathetic and sodden, the symbol of a victory she had not won. Karina, flanked by her two children, Ethan and Sophie, followed Crane. The crowd parted for them once more. their whispers now a frantic, buzzing swarm of speculation. Karina kept her head high, her back straight, but inside she was reeling. Crane's public dismissal of Bianca should have been a triumph, a vindication, yet his tone held no comfort. It was cold, clinical, and his summons felt less like a rescue and more like a pronouncement. The vestry was a small oak-paneled room, smelling of old hymnals and beeswax. A stained glass window depicted a somber scene of resurrection, casting muted blues and reds across the stone floor. It was a cold, airless space. The security guards deposited Bianca onto a velvet-covered chair and took up positions by the door, effectively sealing them all inside. Bianca sat huddled, shivering, looking like a drowned bird. Sophie, Karina's daughter, stood by the window, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of disgust and anxiety. Ethan paced the small room like a caged tiger. "Crane, what is the meaning of this? Why bring that woman in here with us? This should be handled discreetly." "Discretion is a luxury we can no longer afford, Ethan," Crane said, placing his leather briefcase on a small wooden table. He clicked the latches open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "Your father's affairs are more complex than you know." He looked at Bianca. "Miss Reed, I'm sorry for the public nature of my statement. It was necessary to de-escalate a volatile situation. But the facts remain the facts. You held no legal standing with Grayson Davenport. He made you certain financial provisions, which you will be notified of in due course. They are generous, but they are not the provisions of a spouse." Bianca looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Provisions? You think this was about money? I loved him. He loved me. He promised me everything." "Grayson promised many things to many people," Crane said, his voice tinged with a weariness that spoke of years of cleaning up his client's messes. "But a promise of love is not a legal contract." Karina had remained silent, observing. This was what she had expected. The mistress would be paid off. The scandal would be contained. The world would return to its proper axis. She felt a cold sense of satisfaction. "Thank you for clarifying that, Desmond," she said, her voice regaining its customary control. "Now, if you'll have this woman removed, my family would like to grieve in private." It was then that Desmond Crane did something that truly frightened her. He looked at her not with the deference he had shown her for 25 years, but with an expression of profound, almost sorrowful pity. "Karina," he said, and the use of her first name was a jarring intimacy. "Please sit down." A cold dread, far worse than anything she had felt outside, began to pool in her stomach. She remained standing. "I prefer to stand." Crane sighed a long, heavy exhalation. He pulled a sheaf of documents from his briefcase. "As the executor of Grayson's will, it is my duty to ensure that all proceedings are handled according to the letter of the law and that all relevant parties are informed of their true legal status." He paused, his gaze sweeping across all of them. "Which is why I had to state unequivocally that Miss Reed is not the wife." He then fixed his eyes on Karina, and the final unthinkable pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in her mind, a moment before he said the words, "Because Karina, neither are you." The silence in the room was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out. Ethan stopped pacing. Sophie turned from the window, her face pale. Karina felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "What did you say?" she whispered, the words barely audible. "I am so very sorry to be the one to tell you this," Crane said, his voice gentle now, but his words were brutal. "Your marriage to Grayson Davenport, celebrated on June 12, 1999, was not legally valid. For the past 25 years, in the eyes of the law, you have not been his wife." Ethan exploded. "That's insane. That's impossible. I've seen the marriage certificate. We were there." "The certificate exists, yes," Crane conceded. "The wedding happened. The problem is not with your wedding, Karina. The problem is that Grayson was in no legal position to marry you on that day." He slid a document across the table. It was a photocopy, slightly faded, but the header was clear. State of Nevada, Clark County, Certificate of Marriage. Karina stared at it, her mind refusing to process the information. The names on the certificate were Grayson Cole Davenport and Laura Ann Jensen. The date was May 3rd, 1995, 4 years before she had walked down the aisle with him. Who, who is Laura Jensen? Sophie asked, her voice a trembling thread. She was Grayson's first wife, Crane explained, his tone even and factual, as if he were discussing a corporate merger. They married very young in Las Vegas. It lasted less than a year. He told me they had a bitter separation, and he filed for divorce a few months later. He received the final decree and believed he was a free man. He took a breath. He was wrong. A few months ago, during a routine review of his estate planning, something felt off. I have a team that does deep background verification for all our high net worth clients. On a hunch, I asked them to pull the divorce record from Clark County. He slid another paper across the table. They couldn't find one because one was never filed. The lawyer Grayson hired at the time was disbarred for fraud a year later. He took the money and did nothing. Grayson, in his youthful arrogance, never followed up. He took the lawyer's word, received a forged document, and moved on with his life. Crane looked at Karina, his eyes full of a terrible sympathy. Karina, Grayson Davenport never divorced his first wife. He was married to Laura Jensen when he met you. He was married to her when he married you. And he was still married to her on the day he died. The room spun. The carefully constructed identity of Karina Davenport, the foundation upon which her entire adult life was built, crumbled to dust. She wasn't the grieving widow. She wasn't the matriarch of the Davenport dynasty. She was nothing. A partner in an invalid marriage. The mother of two children whose legitimacy could now be questioned. She looked over at Bianca Reed. The girl was staring at her, her own shock momentarily forgotten. For the first time, they were not rivals. They were two women on opposite ends of the same lie. Both deceived, both humiliated, both stripped of the titles they believed were theirs. Karina's legs finally gave way. She sank into a chair, the black veil feeling like a shroud. The rain beat against the stained glass window, the colors bleeding together, a meaningless, chaotic blur. The days that followed the funeral were a fog of surreal legal consultations and hushed, frantic phone calls. The world outside the imposing gates of the Davenport estate continued on, fueled by the salacious headlines that Karina refused to read, but could feel like a constant, low-grade fever. Davenport funeral shocker. Tycoon's secret wives. The widow who wasn't. Her home, a sprawling stone mansion that had always felt like a fortress, now felt like a gilded cage built on a lie. The staff moved about with a new kind of deference, one tinged with pity and uncertainty. Karina was no longer their employer in the traditional sense. She was a guest in a house that might not be hers, her future as precarious as theirs. Ethan was a storm of fury. He'd hired his own team of aggressive corporate lawyers, convinced this was some elaborate ploy by Crane or a shakedown by this unknown first wife. "We'll fight this, Mother," he declared, pacing the length of the Grand Library. "We'll prove he intended to divorce her. We'll argue common law. We'll bury this Laura Jensen in so much litigation she won't know her own name." Sophie, on the other hand, had retreated into a quiet, wounded space. Her father, the hero who had walked her down the aisle just last year, was now a stranger, a man who had built their family on a foundation of deceit. Her questions were softer, but they cut deeper. Did he know? All this time, did he know the divorce wasn't real? That was the question that haunted Karina's sleepless nights. She replayed 25 years of memories, searching for clues, for moments of hesitation or fear in Grayson's eyes. Had his generosity been a product of love or guilt? Was his occasional distance a sign of a wandering eye, or the deep-seated anxiety of a man living a lie? Desmond Crane had provided what little information he had. Grayson, it seemed, had discovered the truth himself about 18 months ago. Not through Crane's due diligence, but by accident. He had been exploring a potential mining venture in Nevada, and the background check on him had flagged an active, existing marriage license in Clark County. He was shaken, Crane had explained in a follow-up meeting, his voice carefully neutral. He confessed the entire situation to me. He was terrified, not of Laura, but of you, Karina, of what this revelation would do to the family, to his legacy. He was trying to find a way to fix it without blowing up his entire world. Fix it? Karina had asked, her voice hollow. How does one fix a 25-year fraudulent marriage? He was trying to find her, Crane admitted. Quietly, he wanted to offer her a generous settlement in exchange for a discreet, retroactive divorce. But she had vanished. Laura Jensen, after leaving him, had seemingly dropped off the face of the earth. That was where Crane's information ended. Grayson had died suddenly of a heart attack on his private jet before he could locate the ghost who held the keys to his entire life. Karina, against Ethan's enraged protests, decided she needed to find Laura Jensen herself. This wasn't about a legal strategy. It was about reclaiming some piece of her own narrative. She couldn't spend the rest of her life as the woman who was duped. She needed to look the real Mrs. Davenport in the eye. She didn't use Ethan's high-priced lawyers or the family's regular investigators. She hired a man named Frank Miller, a retired detective with tired eyes and a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found. She met him not in a sterile office, but in a quiet coffee shop downtown, feeling for the first time like a clandestine figure in her own life. I don't have much to go on, she said, pushing a thin file across the table. It contained the copy of the marriage license and the few biographical details Crane had on Laura Jensen from the time of her marriage to Grayson. She was 21, working as a waitress at a casino coffee shop, originally from a small town in rural Oregon called Havenwood. Frank Miller glanced at the file, his expression unchanging. People move, change their names. A woman who left a bad marriage 30 years ago, she probably doesn't go by Jensen anymore. This won't be easy. I don't need easy, Karina replied, her voice firm. I need the truth. For 2 weeks there was silence. Karina moved through her days like an automaton. She oversaw the caterers for gatherings she no longer felt entitled to host. She answered condolence calls from friends whose whispers she could practically hear through the phone lines. She felt a strange kinship with Bianca Reed, the foolish girl in the white dress. Both of them had been orbiting a sun that was, in reality, a black hole, consuming the truth of their lives. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, Frank Miller called. I found her, he said, his voice crackling over the line. Or at least, I found where she went. Karina's heart hammered against her ribs. Where is she? She never really left, Miller said. After Vegas, she went home. To Havenwood, Oregon. She took back her maiden name. She's Laura Connolly now, remarried about 20 years ago. Husband passed a few years back. She owns a small bookstore on the town's main street. Connolly's Corner Books. Seems she's been there the whole time. The simplicity of it was staggering. Grayson, with his global network and limitless resources, had been searching for a ghost in sprawling metropolises and foreign countries. But Laura Jensen had just gone home. Is she aware of the situation? Karina asked, dreading the answer. Hard to say, Miller replied. Havenwood is a small town. They have the internet, but she doesn't strike me as the type to follow the society pages. From what I can tell, she's quiet, well-respected, lives a simple life. No one I spoke to mentioned a connection to anyone named Davenport. A simple life, the phrase echoed in Karina's mind. While she had been navigating a complex world of corporate takeovers and charity galas, Laura Jensen had been selling books in a small town. While Karina had been sleeping next to a man with a secret that could unravel their entire existence, Laura had been living an honest life. I need the address, Karina said, her decision solidifying in that instant. You're not thinking of going there? Miller asked, a note of caution in his voice. Maybe let the lawyers handle this first. The lawyers have done enough, Karina said. This is not about the law anymore. This is about two women who were married to the same man. She booked a flight to Portland for the next morning under her maiden name, Moreau. She packed a small bag, leaving behind the designer clothes that felt like a costume. For the first time in 25 years, she was not traveling as Mrs. Davenport. She was just Karina, a woman in search of a ghost, hoping to find the truth in a small-town bookstore. Havenwood, Oregon, was less a town and more a collection of buildings clinging to the side of a winding mountain road, perpetually shrouded in a soft, misty rain. It was the antithesis of Karina's world. There were no valets, no gleaming high-rises, No sense of urgent, striving ambition. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a clean, honest scent that felt foreign and unsettling. Connolly's Corner Books was exactly as Frank Miller had described it, a small, inviting shop with a green-painted door and large bay windows filled with stacks of books and a sleeping calico cat. A little bell chimed as Karina pushed the door open, announcing her arrival. The inside was warm and crammed with floor-to-ceiling shelves, the comforting smell of old paper and brewing tea hanging in the air. Behind a large wooden counter, a woman with reading glasses perched on her nose looked up. She had kind, intelligent eyes framed by laugh lines, and her silver-streaked brown hair was pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a simple cardigan over a plain cotton blouse. She was perhaps a few years older than Karina, her face weathered by a life lived under the open sky, not under the careful ministrations of dermatologists. This was Laura Jensen, the real Mrs. Grayson Davenport. "Can I help you find something?" Laura asked, her voice calm and pleasant. Karina's carefully rehearsed speeches evaporated. All the anger, the prepared legal positions, the accusations, they all felt absurd in the face of this unassuming woman in her quiet sanctuary. I'm not sure," Karina stammered, feeling like an intruder. "I'm looking for Laura Connolly." The woman's smile was gentle. "Well, you found her. Is there something I can do for you?" Karina took a breath, her heart pounding. "My name is Karina Moreau. I need to speak with you about a man we both knew. A long time ago. Grayson Davenport." The name dropped into the quiet bookstore like a stone. Laura's smile didn't vanish, but it tightened at the edges. The light in her eyes flickered, replaced by a guarded, weary caution. She slowly took off her glasses, placing them on the counter. "Davenport," she repeated, the name sounding foreign on her tongue. "I haven't heard that name in a very long time. What about him?" "He passed away," Karina said softly. 2 weeks ago." Laura's expression was unreadable. There was no shock, no grief, just a quiet, thoughtful stillness. She nodded slowly. "I see. I'm sorry to hear that. He was very young." She looked at Karina more closely, a flicker of dawning comprehension in her eyes. "Moreau, you said?" "I don't know that name. How did you know Grayson?" Here it was, the moment of truth. "For the last 25 years, Karina said, her voice shaking slightly, "I believed I was his wife, Karina Davenport." Laura stared at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the soft purring of the cat. Laura's face paled, and she gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "You believed?" Laura whispered. "What does that mean, you believed?" "Grayson and I were married in 1999, Karina explained, the story sounding more fantastic and cruel with every word she spoke. "We had 2 children. We built a life. It was only after his death that I discovered our marriage was invalid, because he never divorced you." Laura sank onto a stool behind the counter, her composure finally breaking. She put a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a shock that spanned 3 decades. "No," she breathed. "No, that can't be right. He sent me the papers. I signed them. He told me it was final." "The lawyer he used was a fraud," Karina said, feeling a strange and unwelcome wave of sympathy for this woman whose life was being upended just as hers had been. "He took Grayson's money and disappeared. The divorce was never filed." Laura let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "That son of a bitch," she said, her voice thick with a long-buried anger. "Even from the grave. He's still finding ways to mess up my life." She looked up at Karina, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "So that whole time, all these years, I've been, what? Still married to him?" The absurdity of it seemed to hit her all at once. "My second husband, Patrick. Our marriage. Your marriage to Mr. Connolly would have been legally invalid as well," Karina finished for her, the words tasting like poison. She was a harbinger of chaos, destroying this woman's peace just as hers had been destroyed. Laura closed her eyes, taking a few deep, ragged breaths. The bell on the door chimed again, but she didn't look up. An elderly customer ambled in, and Laura waved a hand dismissively. Just browsing, Tom. I'll be with you in a minute. She opened her eyes and looked at Karina, truly looked at her for the first time. The animosity Karina had expected to see wasn't there. In its place was a deep, resonating sorrow. You poor woman, Laura said, and the genuine compassion in her voice almost broke Karina. To find that out now, after all that time, and your children? Oh, your poor children. Karina had come prepared for a fight, for a greedy woman who would see this as a lottery win. She had not come prepared for kindness. He told me you had a bitter separation, Karina found herself saying, that you took everything he had and vanished. Laura shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. He had nothing to take. He was a charismatic, ambitious boy with holes in his pockets and dreams bigger than the Nevada sky. I was a waitress putting him through his last year of business school. The bitter separation was me finding out he was sleeping with the daughter of one of his professors to try and get ahead. She sighed. I packed a bag and took a bus home to Oregon. I just wanted to be done with him. He begged me not to file for divorce in our home state, said it would look bad for his career prospects. He insisted on handling it through a discreet lawyer in Vegas. I just wanted it over, so I signed what he sent me and tried to forget he ever existed. The image of the powerful, sophisticated Grayson Davenport was replaced by that of a callow, insecure young man, already willing to lie and cheat to get what he wanted. He hadn't changed at all. He had just gotten better at it. The two women sat in silence for a long time, the wife who was and the wife who thought she was. Two strangers bound by the colossal, lifelong deceit of one man. What happens now? Laura finally asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. What do you want from me? I don't know, Karina admitted, and it was the most honest thing she had said in weeks. I thought I wanted a fight. I thought I wanted to prove my life meant something. But now, I think I just want it to be over. Laura nodded, her gaze distant, looking out the window at the quiet, rainy street. When Patrick, my late husband, died, I thought my world had ended. But I was his wife. Our life was real. I can't imagine what it feels like to find out your world wasn't what you thought it was. She looked back at Karina. He left a mess, didn't he? And now we're the ones left to clean it up. In that moment, in the quiet sanctuary of a bookstore at what felt like the end of the world, Karina realized this was not her enemy. This was the only other person on the planet who could possibly understand the depth of Grayson's betrayal. This was, impossibly, her ally. The initial meeting in the bookstore stretched into a long, strange afternoon. Laura flipped the sign on the door to closed, brewed a pot of strong tea, and led Karina to a small apartment upstairs. It was a cozy, lived-in space filled with more books, comfortable, slightly worn furniture, and framed photos of a smiling, kind-faced man Karina presumed was Patrick Connolly. It was a home built on love and truth, and the contrast with her own opulent, hollow mansion was a physical ache in her chest. They talked for hours. It was not the conversation Karina had ever imagined having. There was no rage, no accusations. Instead, it was a quiet, somber exchange of information. Two archaeologists carefully excavating the ruins of a life they had unknowingly shared. Karina spoke of the man Grayson became, the corporate titan, the demanding but often generous father, the man who craved public adoration. Laura, in turn, painted a portrait of the boy he had been, fiercely intelligent, desperate to escape his poor background, charming to a fault, but with a moral compass that spun wildly whenever his ambition was at stake. He always believed the rules didn't apply to him, Laura said, staring into her teacup. He thought he could bend reality to his will just by wanting it enough. I see now that he never grew out of that. They discovered they were both pawns, used for different purposes at different stages of his life. Laura had been the starter wife, the one who supported him when he had nothing, the one he needed to shed to begin his ascent. Karina had been the society wife, the perfect partner to help him build and legitimize his empire, the beautiful facade for the world to admire. And Bianca Reed, she was the final act, the trophy of a man who needed constant validation, proof that he was still desired. He compartmentalized everything, Karina realized aloud. Us, his business, his children, each in a separate box. As long as the boxes never touched, He thought he was in control. By the end of the day, a fragile, unspoken alliance had formed between them. It was born not of friendship, but of shared victimhood and a mutual desire for a just resolution. Ethan's lawyers had been calling Karina nonstop, demanding she return so they could file motions to contest Laura's spousal rights. "They want to paint you as an opportunist," Karina told Laura bluntly. "They'll say you knew about the divorce being invalid and waited all these years to cash in." Laura gave a weary smile. "Let them try. I have 30 years of tax returns, a life, and a whole town of witnesses to prove I've never seen a dime from Grayson Davenport or wanted one. What about you? What do your children think of all this?" The question brought a fresh wave of pain. "My son wants a war. My daughter, she just wants to understand the man her father was. Then we owe it to her and to ourselves to handle this with dignity," Laura said firmly. "No more of Grayson's lies and legal games. Let's get everything out in the open." "What happens next?" "The reading of the will," Karina said. "Desmond Crane has scheduled it for next week. He insists it must proceed. He said Grayson made specific, last-minute changes after he discovered the truth about your marriage. He wants you there, Laura. He wants all of us there." The idea was terrifying. A room containing the three women who had all, at one point, believed they were the center of Grayson's universe: the legal wife, the de facto wife, and the mistress. It was a situation ripe for disaster. Laura, however, seemed resolute. "Then I'll be there. It's time I close this chapter of my life for good. And you and I," she said, looking directly at Karina, "will walk in there together." The flight back to New York was surreal. Laura, who hadn't been on a plane in 15 years, sat beside Karina, looking out at the clouds with a quiet sense of wonder. Karina, accustomed to the hushed luxury of private jets, found the anonymity of commercial flights strangely comforting. They were just two women heading towards a reckoning. When they landed, Karina didn't take Laura to a hotel. On impulse, she brought her back to the Davenport mansion. It was a power move, though Karina wasn't entirely sure who it was directed at. Ethan was apoplectic. "Mother, have you lost your mind?" he seethed, cornering her in the grand foyer as Laura stood awkwardly by, holding her small, worn suitcase. "You brought her here? Into our home? The lawyers will kill you. This is the woman who is trying to steal our inheritance." "She is not trying to steal anything, Ethan," Karina said, her voice steel. "She is the woman your father was legally married to. This is her house as much as it is ours, perhaps more so. Show some respect." The confrontation was a sign of the battles to come, but seeing Laura standing in the marble-floored hall, looking small and out of place beneath the soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, solidified something in Karina. She had spent her life defending this house, this name, this legacy, but the legacy was a lie. The only thing left to defend was the truth. The day before the will reading, Karina did something even more impulsive. She called Bianca Reed. The number had been in the private investigator's file, a detail she had committed to memory with a morbid fascination. Bianca answered on the second ring, her voice wary and sullen. "What do you want?" "I think we should meet," Karina said simply. "Before tomorrow, all three of us." There was a long pause. "All three?" Bianca asked, confusion lacing her voice. "Yes," Karina said. "Laura Jensen is here with me. I think it's time everyone who was deceived by Grayson Davenport sat in the same room." She suggested a neutral location, a private suite in a downtown hotel. She wasn't sure if Bianca would show up, but an hour later, the younger woman walked in, looking pale and tired, the defiant fire she'd had at the funeral all but extinguished. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, her face scrubbed of makeup. She looked her age for the first time, young and lost. She stopped short when she saw Laura. She had clearly been following the news. She stared at the quiet, older woman as if she were seeing a mythical creature. The meeting was tense and awkward. Bianca was defensive, Laura was quietly observant, and Karina found herself in the unexpected role of mediator. "I don't understand why I'm here," Bianca said, directing her words to Karina. "You hate me. You have every reason to." "I don't have the energy for hate anymore," Karina replied honestly. "Grayson used all of us. He promised you a future he could never give you. He gave me a present that was built on a lie from his past. And he erased Laura completely. We can either tear each other apart for the scraps he left behind, or we can face what comes tomorrow with some semblance of unity. Bianca looked at Laura. Did he ever talk about you? Laura shook her head. I doubt Grayson spent a single day of the last 30 years thinking about me, until he was forced to. I was an inconvenience he thought he dealt with. Hearing this seemed to change something in Bianca. Her fantasy had been that her love for Grayson was so powerful it had eclipsed his marriage to Karina. But the truth was far more humbling. They were all just footnotes in the grand, selfish story of Grayson Davenport. He hadn't loved her enough to be honest. He hadn't respected Karina enough to be honest. He hadn't cared about Laura enough to be honest. He told me he was trapped, Bianca whispered, more to herself than to them. He said his life with her, she nodded towards Karina, was just for show, for the business. He said his heart was with me. He told me our life was the only thing that was real to him, Karina countered, her voice flat. That women like you were meaningless distractions. They were reciting lines from the same script, written by a man who had cast them all in supporting roles. For the first time, in that sterile hotel suite, the three women saw each other not as rivals, but as fellow survivors of the same shipwreck. They didn't leave as friends, but they left with a shared, bitter understanding. They would face the reading of the will not as enemies, but as a united front against the ghost of the man who had wronged them all. The conference room at Desmond Crane's law firm was a monument to power. With dark mahogany walls and a panoramic view of the city, Grayson Davenport had considered his kingdom. The air was thick with tension. At one side of the long, polished table sat Ethan and Sophie. Ethan's jaw was tight with resentment, while Sophie looked pale and withdrawn. The doors opened. Into Ethan's visible disgust, the three women he least wanted to see walked in together. Karina, poised and elegant, but with a new, unreadable strength. Beside her, Laura Connolly, looking nervous but resolute in a simple dress that was a world away from the room's corporate luxury. A few steps behind, a subdued Bianca Reed completed the unholy trinity. They took their seats opposite the Davenport children, a silent, unified block that immediately shifted the room's power dynamic. Desmond Crane entered, his face a grim mask. He sat at the head of the table and opened a thick, leather-bound portfolio. We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Grayson Cole Davenport, he began, his voice formal. This will was amended 18 months ago, shortly after Mr. Davenport became aware of certain legal discrepancies concerning his marital status. He was, at the time of its signing, of sound mind. Ethan leaned forward impatiently. Let's get on with it, Crane. We all know my father's intentions. The company, the estate, it belongs to his family. He shot a venomous glare across the table. Not to outsiders. Crane ignored him. I will begin with the smaller bequests. He read through a list of dispositions to charities and employees before his eyes settled on Bianca. To Miss Bianca Reed, Crane read, in recognition of her companionship, I leave the sum of $5 million to be placed in a trust. This bequest is conditional upon her signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding her relationship with me. Bianca flinched. It was exactly as she had feared. Hush money, a final, insulting transaction that reduced their supposed great love to a line item on a ledger. The life-changing sum felt like a pittance, a public dismissal of her worth. Crane continued, Now, regarding the primary residences, the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, the villa in Tuscany, and the chalet in Aspen are to be placed in a trust for the benefit of my children, Ethan and Sophie Davenport. A small victory for Ethan, but Karina noted the glaring omission of the main Greenwich estate where she had built her life. The Greenwich estate, Crane went on, looking directly at Karina, along with its contents and grounds, I leave solely and without encumbrance to Karina Moreau. A collective gasp went through the room. He had used her maiden name. The will's next words explain why. This is not a spousal inheritance, Crane quoted, but a severance package for 25 years of unparalleled service as a business partner, social strategist, and mother to my children. He also leaves you a lifetime annuity of $250,000 a year, under the same terms. It was a golden parachute, a final, devastating rejection. He was acknowledging her work, but publicly stripping her of the title of wife. He was paying her for her time. A cold, hollow feeling spread through Karina's chest. A severance package? Ethan was on his feet, his voice shaking with rage. She was his wife. According to the law, Ethan, she was not, Crane said calmly. And this will reflect the legal reality your father was fully aware of when he signed it. He held up a hand to silence further protest. And now, he said, his voice dropping, we come to the heart of the matter. The controlling interest in Davenport Industries, 51% of the voting shares, valued at approximately $4 billion. The room was utterly silent. This was the throne. I, Grayson Cole Davenport, Crane read slowly, each word landing with immense weight, do hereby bequeath my entire controlling interest in Davenport Industries, all 51% of the shares, to be held in trust and managed for the sole benefit of my legal wife. He paused, letting the silence stretch like a rack. Laura Ann Connolly, formerly Jensen. The bombshell detonated with a deafening silence. Ethan collapsed back into his chair, his face ashen. Sophie let out a small, choked sob. Laura herself looked utterly stunned, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at Crane in disbelief. This can't be real, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. He hated her. He said she was nothing to him. Perhaps he felt he owed a debt, Crane said, his gaze softening slightly as he looked at Laura. The will is ironclad. He specifies the reason. For the life she was denied and the honesty she deserved. He further stipulates that for the first 5 years I will act as chair of the board to ensure a smooth transition and to advise Mrs. Connolly. After that, control is entirely hers. He closed the portfolio. The remainder of the estate's assets will be split equally between his children. That concludes the reading. The room was a maelstrom of shattered expectations. Ethan looked broken, his birthright stolen and given to a stranger. Sophie wept quietly into her hands, but it was Laura who spoke first, her voice shaking but clear. I don't want it. All eyes snapped to her. I don't want his company, she repeated, looking at the shocked faces around the table. I don't want his money. I run a bookstore. I wouldn't know the first thing about running a global corporation. The will is the will, Laura, Crane said gently. You cannot refuse the inheritance, though you are free to do with it as you wish. Laura looked across the table, past the devastated children, her eyes meeting Karina's. In that moment of shared shock and impossible circumstance, an idea sparked in Karina's mind. A path forward so audacious it took her own breath away. Grayson had left behind a legacy of chaos, designed to make them tear each other apart. But what if they refused to play his game? Karina stood up, her movement drawing every eye. She looked at Laura, at her children, and then at Desmond Crane. Perhaps, she said, her voice clear and steady, Mrs. Connolly doesn't have to run it alone. Karina's statement sliced through the room's stunned silence. Ethan, his face a mask of betrayal, shot to his feet. Mother, what are you saying? You're siding with her. I'm proposing a solution, Ethan, Karina said, her voice a study in calm authority. Your father built his empire on secrets and division. He designed this to make us fight over the pieces. I refuse to play his game. She looked directly at Laura, whose expression was one of bewildered shock. Laura, you hold all the power, but I have 25 years of experience inside this company. Ethan was groomed to run it. Sophie has the conscience this family has always lacked. She laid out her audacious plan, a new board, a new way forward. Laura, as the majority shareholder, would be the final authority. The moral center Grayson had tried to erase. Karina would be a strategic advisor. Ethan could be CEO, but he would answer to a board run by the women his father wronged. And Sophie would lead a new, powerful ethics and philanthropy division tasked with healing the damage the company had done. He left us a broken kingdom, Karina concluded. We can let it fall to ruin, or we can rule it together. It was an unthinkable alliance. Desmond Crane, the stoic lawyer, simply noted that the proposal was unorthodox but legally ironclad. The decision rested with Laura. The weeks that followed were a crucible of negotiation. Ethan fought it, seeing his birthright being given to a committee. But the alternative was losing everything. Sophie saw a chance to finally do real good and was the first to agree. Laura, the quiet bookseller from Oregon, weighed her simple life against the enormous, complex responsibility. Ultimately, she agreed. The new structure was cemented by a final, unexpected act from Bianca Reed. Before disappearing with her hush money, she provided Karina with documents Grayson had foolishly shared. Proof of a shady offshore venture that gave the new board the leverage it needed to purge the company's corrupt elements. 6 months later, the world of high finance was still buzzing about the Davenport women. Laura Connolly chaired the board meetings via video conference from her bookstore, her quiet, common-sense questions cutting through corporate nonsense. Karina, having shed the Davenport name for her own, Moreau, was a formidable presence, her strategic insights unmatched. Ethan, humbled but competent, ran the daily operations, slowly earning the respect of the women he answered to. The Davenport Foundation, under Sophie's leadership, was making headlines for its aggressive and transparent charitable work. Karina sold the Greenwich mansion. With the funds from Grayson's severance package, she bought a modern apartment that was entirely her own. She and Laura were not friends but allies, bound by a shared, complicated history. They had taken the chaos Grayson left behind and built something stronger, more honest. They were not defined by his legacy, but by their own resilience. What an absolutely insane roller coaster of secrets, lies, and ultimate justice. A story that starts with a funeral ends with the birth of a new kind of dynasty. It just goes to show you that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way to the surface. And sometimes the people you think are your greatest enemies can become your most powerful allies. What would you have done if you were Karina? Or Laura? Could you have found it in yourself to work together after such a deep betrayal? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. If this story shocked you and kept you on the edge of your seat, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories of unbelievable drama and twisted tales, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.